Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello to those of you that have already logged on. The webinar will begin in 1 minute. If those that are on will please use your dashboard to raise your hand and let me know that you can hear me. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fifth and final of a series being offered through the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction Exceptional Children Division. Today's webinar will focus on providing foundational guidance within this course of 1 hour that we have to support school providers as we move towards the policy shift in the evaluation and identification of specific learning disabilities that will be required of all schools effective July 1, 2020. Again, the purpose of this session today is solely to provide guidance to assist all listeners that are on today in preparing for this transition. By no means will we be able to cover in 1 hour everything that we will be planning on rolling out in terms of support over the course of the next few years. Also, I would like to note that I will be delivering information only today. Due to the limited window of time that we have, we will not be able to respond to any specific questions during this hour. For any additional questions that you may have, please feel free to post them in the questions section that is located in your dashboard. Your webinar dashboard should show you an area that you can post questions. If you see that on your dashboard, you can certainly enter in questions there and submit them. We will take all of the questions entered and add them with answers to these content slides, and we'll make this available after the webinar. If there happen to be a high number of questions sent in, we will create a document to serve as a companion to this webinar and also make that available with the questions and answers. Today, on your dashboard, if you see, there are 2 handouts provided to the audience. They can be found, again, within your dashboard under the questions section. There's a handout section, and you may go in there and pull up a copy of today's slides, as well as a copy of the 2020 SLD policy addendum. So it's the policy pieces that were approved by the State Board of Ed, and it serves as an addendum to our existing policy. Those are the components that will become effective on July 1, 2020. So, moving on to our presentation today. I am Lynn McCord, the consultant for school psychology with North Carolina Department of Public Instruction and the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities. Today, I am pleased to have my colleague, Lynn Lozer, with me. Lynn is the statewide consultant for specific learning disabilities and ADHD with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction Exceptional Children's Division. Welcome today, Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn. Learning disabilities are perhaps best described as unexpected, significant difficulties in academic achievement in related areas of learning and behavior in students who have not responded to high-quality instruction and intervention and whose difficulties cannot be attributed to medical, educational, environmental, or psychiatric causes. We have a unique opportunity to improve outcomes for students with learning disabilities in our state through the deliberate pairing of a multi-tiered system of support with the changes in special education policy that provide for a comprehensive evaluation that results in effective instruction and accelerated learning. An RTI-based evaluation must be guided by the conviction that we have the knowledge and skills to assure that all students, including those with specific learning disabilities, can learn and achieve at high levels. An important question for school teams to reach consensus around is this about eligibility only, or about ensuring that students with specific learning disabilities get the instruction needed to significantly improve school performance? Eligibility determination that does not result in effective instruction may be a denial of the fundamental right of each student to have equity in access to effective instruction. Let's look at who are our students with specific learning disabilities in North Carolina. 37% of all students with disabilities in North Carolina are identified as SLD. This is slightly above the national count of 35%. This represents the largest group of students with disabilities in the state. Now let's look at some proficiency data for students with disabilities, including students with learning disabilities. Taking a wide look at the national data for all students with disabilities on the NAEP, or the National Assessment of Educational Progress, less than 10% of 8th grade students with disabilities are proficient in reading and math, compared to 27 and 24% respectively of all North Carolina students. The 2014 NCLD State of Learning Disabilities report showed that 1/3 of students with learning disabilities have been retained a grade. Now let's take a closer look at the 2014-15 proficiency data in North Carolina. In the area of reading, 12.3% of 3rd grade students with learning disabilities scored at or above a level 3, compared to 59% of all students. In math, 22% of 3rd grade students with specific learning disabilities scored a level 3 or above, compared to 62% of all students. In fact, students with learning disabilities were the lowest performing group of students with disabilities. And finally, the graduation rate for students with disabilities is 67.3%, whereas the rate for all students is 85.6%. The good news is that this rate is steadily increasing and keeping pace with the graduation rate for all students. The bad news is we're not closing the gap. The vast majority of students with learning disabilities spend 80% or more of their school day in the general education setting. What this means is that if we are going to impact outcomes for students with learning disabilities, it must be a joint effort of general education and special education. Students must receive strong, differentiated core instruction as well as specially designed instruction that meets the unique needs of the learner. Thus, the necessity to view the SLD policy as an instructional model embedded within a multi-tiered system of support framework. This graphic provides an overview of the criteria for an evaluation under the policy that will become effective July 1, 2020. For those familiar with the current policy, you will note the criteria has not changed. What has changed is the data sources you will use to make eligibility decisions. Evaluation begins with the convergence of data from multiple sources, which was the focus of Lynn's last webinar, and she will also address this later in today's session. We begin with lack of appropriate instruction. We have intentionally placed this as the first criteria. This requirement is designed to ensure that students are not identified as having a learning disability and needing special education when their inadequate achievement and insufficient rate of progress are the result of a lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math. If the team cannot document that the student's difficulties are not a result of a lack of instruction, the student may not be identified as eligible for special education. Although within IDEA, the assurance of appropriate instruction is considered an exclusionary factor, North Carolina considers it an inclusionary factor, meaning that the assurance that the child is receiving instruction that benefits the majority of students, including subgroups, has been well established through the problem-solving process. Now let's look at exclusionary factors. We have placed exclusionary factors as the second criterion, since these factors should be addressed through the problem-solving process and ruled out as possible reasons for the student's lack of response and brought to the evaluation process as existing data. The exclusionary factors remain unchanged from previous policy, with the exception of the loss of instructional time. Loss of instructional time ensures that disciplinary removals or suspensions, absences, tardies, or high mobility rates are not the primary reason for the inadequate achievement. Here, the team must ask, has the student had ample opportunity to learn what is expected in the area of concern? Inadequate achievement compared to age and grade level standards. Within this criterion, comparison to intellectual development has been removed, which aligns North Carolina policy to the IDEA. Rather than establishing inadequate achievement as compared to intellectual development, North Carolina policy, consistent with IDEA, compares the student's achievement to age and grade level standards through the use of multiple data sources when provided learning experiences and instruction appropriate for the child's age or grade. So again, within this criterion, the assurance of appropriate instruction and intervention in reading and math is again emphasized. To document the student's discrepancy or gap between current and grade or age level standards, The evaluation team gathers data from district and state assessments, universal screening, progress monitoring, and other available assessments. The preponderance of data across data sources should indicate inadequate achievement in one of the 8 areas of a learning disability. Note again that this gap does not consider the student's intellectual ability. Insufficient progress. This criterion requires that the child does not make sufficient progress to meet age or state-approved grade level standards when provided appropriate instruction and intervention. Evaluating the student's rate of growth relative to the rate of growth needed for long-term academic success is the essence of determining whether the student has responded to instruction and intervention and is at the heart of RTI. The evaluation team analyzes all of the graphically represented progress monitoring data. This includes a comparison of the student's rate of progress to expected rates of progress, including evidence that the intervention yielded successful responses and outcomes for the majority of students receiving the intervention. Lastly, it is important to note that all of the criteria are required for an eligibility decision, including the additional prongs of an adverse effect and the need for special education. We're going to take you through some big ideas of ways that you can begin to evaluate your current processes and begin your transition to July 1, 2020. The first big idea is that appropriate instruction is inclusionary. This requirement, which applies to all evaluations, including those that do not use RTI, directs evaluation teams to document that the referred student has been provided with instruction and interventions that are sufficient to allow for adequate progress. If the team cannot document that the student's difficulties are not a result of lack of instruction, the student may not be identified. For example, for a student demonstrating a reading difficulty, there should be evidence that he or she was provided with a scientifically research-based program that adequately addresses the big ideas in reading, i.e. phonemic awareness, alphabetic principle, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Similarly, the evaluation team must document that repeated assessments, such as universal screening and progress monitoring, were conducted on a regular basis and that the results of these assessments were shared meaningfully with parents. This requirement has not changed and is not new. This requirement includes a number of important features of the infrastructure associated with a multi-tiered system of support. Has Tier 1 instruction been effective, or core instruction been effective with the majority of students with some similar demographics? General educators are the primary instructors of our students with specific learning disabilities. We know that students with disabilities do better in schools where core instruction is effective. Are there school-wide, universally available instruction and supports to ensure equity in access and high expectations for all learners? Is there a shared belief that all students can achieve at high levels? We recognize that this is an area that school psychologists often feel powerless and is a source of frustration. However, all of North Carolina, almost all, in fact 97% of North Carolina LEAs are now in an MTSS cohort. We urge you to find out who your MTSS district leadership team is and to get involved. Start having these conversations in the schools where you work. Set the expectation now and begin the work now. Big idea number 2. Intervention integrity is a must. Evaluation for eligibility decisions requires evaluating the effects of current and past interventions to determine whether an appropriate instructional plan has been identified and whether the student remains significantly discrepant from peers or educational expectations. Without this, you cannot assure appropriate instruction was provided. Perhaps one of the most notable and prevalent threats to the accuracy of a multi-tiered system of support is the lack of implementation integrity. Why assess instruction and intervention sufficiency? There are many reasons why a student might have low achievement. Low achievement by itself is not an indication of a learning disability. The most accurate means of identifying a student with a specific learning disability is in the context of the provision of effective instruction and intervention. The concept of unexpectedness for students with learning disabilities is exhibited when the student has low achievement and insufficient progress when provided appropriate instruction and intervention that is research-based, matched to student need, and of sufficient intensity and duration. The evaluation of students with learning disabilities without the examination of intervention sufficiency is prone to error and may result in the over-identification of students. What are some ways that we can assess intervention sufficiency or intervention integrity? We can do a direct observation of the intervention. We can use treatment integrity checklists that correspond to features of the intervention. Formal fidelity checks conducted by coaches and/or administrators. We can maintain logs of the instructional sessions. And we can use progress monitoring data of similar peers receiving the same intervention. School psychologists can serve on school-based data teams. We encourage you to become a member of these teams, to examine the questions on the screen relative to groups of students. An advantage of an RTI-based approach is that problem-solving and intervention precedes evaluation, and this information not only informs evaluation and identification, but more importantly, informs instruction and intervention.
Moving on to big idea 3. Responsiveness to instruction and intervention alone is not a comprehensive evaluation. Misperceptions continue to abound across the education field here in the state of North Carolina, as well as with parents, advocacy groups, and others. It is our job to be able to communicate effectively with all stakeholders involved in working with students that may or may not have a specific learning disability, that we are able to communicate what would actually constitute a comprehensive evaluation. We need to all have an understanding that assessment data of a student's responsiveness does not meet the full requirement of a full and individual evaluation. RTI is a necessary part of Criterion 3, as well as needed information to help establish Criterion 4. but alone is not sufficient to meet the requirement of a comprehensive evaluation. For those of you that saw the webinar that I did on multiple sources of data, no, I didn't forget to remove this slide. We will continue to see the information that we're doing, that we have available to us around our current practices. So in the state of North Carolina, our policy manual, again, is referenced here in the definition of evaluation. That's been the definition of evaluation since the reauthorization of the IDEA. This helps us to underscore Big Idea 3. Clearly states that multiple sources of data must be used to arrive at eligibility decision. It also clearly states that any eligibility decision must not be dependent on single test scores. We can't emphasize this enough, and remember that this is what our current policy requirement is. I invite the audience to reflect on whether or not this is being adhered to. Consider what eligibility decisions are based on in your district. Ask your general ed colleagues who participate in the IEP meetings the data sources that they think are used to determine eligibility. Ask your special education colleagues, are we, maybe unintentionally, but are we sending a message that we are over-relying on single sources of data to arrive at these high-stakes special education decisions? In exploring your current practices, think through this question. What does the synthesis of information look like in the evaluation reports that are provided, in the documentation processes that exist? What data sources are being used for your eligibility decisions and clearly documented and clearly understood by all those that are attending those meetings and helping to make those decisions? Quickly, just referencing back to where our federal regulations also underscore this requirement. When we are conducting an evaluation, we must use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to gather relevant information. We must not use any single measure or assessment as the sole criterion for determining whether a child has a disability, and the instruments that we use must be technically sound. Continuing on, in the determination of eligibility, our federal regulations require us to draw upon information from a variety of sources and to ensure that the information obtained from all of these sources is documented and carefully considered. So when we think through the multiple sources of data that are fed forward and carefully considered, an evaluation actually begins with the review of the existing data. The existing data that is documented through the initial referral provides the basis and feeds forward into an individualized formal evaluation. As Lynn referenced earlier, this includes but is not limited to your universal screening data, your benchmark assessment data, your progress monitoring data, any diagnostic assessment data, and all other relevant data that is reviewed around observations, parent input, etc. That moves the case into collection and synthesis of the information that would come from utilizing, if necessary, other assessment tools that are appropriately matched to the student's suspected needs. And then from there, the evaluation concludes in the synthesis of all of the data that has been gathered, documented, and collected within the assessment, pulling all of that together to inform our decisions and answering the questions of what's needed to accelerate academic and/or functional growth for the student. Moving on to big idea 4. Evaluation for eligibility is a continuation of the problem-solving process, not the goal of it. One of the quotes that we reference a lot is from the Kowaleski book that we talk about often, and it states that the full intent of special education is to devise a program of instruction that will accelerate the student's progress beyond that which was realized during the provision of multi-tiered supports. So when you're exploring your current practices, think through whether or not special education is embedded within a multi-tiered system of support. Are there seamless systems that exist between special ed and general ed? How will information gathered through a multi-tiered system be used to inform the design and delivery of specially designed instruction if that student is determined eligible? And how will systematic problem solving be used to evaluate the effectiveness of special education, both overall and at the individual student level? Although what I've referenced over the past few slides were North Carolina existing policies and the federal regulations, this slide is reflective of part of the changes that were made in the addendum to the SLD policy. And this will be part of what will be required effective July 1, 2020. So the requirement of the use of a systematic problem-solving process based on the child's response to scientific research-based interventions and the evaluation of data documenting the child's response to instruction in scientific research-based intervention. In other words, if a child is determined eligible, the finish line is not at the point of special education placement. The system of problem solving continues. The design and delivery of instruction and intervention becomes more focused, and the progress monitoring of effectiveness of services continues, because the intent of special education is to accelerate a child's progress in order to close the performance gap that exists, the reason that got them into special education to begin with. Consider practices and mindsets around this big idea. And reflect on, the questions that you see on that slide. Begin conversations with your district level, school level, and staff and colleagues. Is special education embedded within a multi-tiered system of support? Is there more of a seamless system between special ed and general ed? Because within a complete description of a multi-tiered system of support, we must articulate how special education is delivered within that system. And how is the information that's gathered through that multi-tiered system be used to inform the design and delivery of our special education? And how do we problem solve to help evaluate the effectiveness of our special education's programs and at the individual student level, the services that they're receiving? When you're looking at this, think about this question and determine what an answer might be within your buildings, within your district, within yourselves. A response of true falls outside the realm of problem solving and sound decision making based in evidence and relevant data. To view a framework of multi-tiered system of supports as a process through which a student arrives at special education referral is entirely missing it. RTI is not something that a student enters into. It is what the adults do to measure a student's level of functioning and determine the instructional needs of the child within a multi-tiered system. Solid decision-making can't exist outside of a multi-tiered system of support. However, the multi-tiered system of support exists at all levels, including special education. You don't move through one to get to the other. And that leads us into big idea number 5. When you reflect on big idea 4, the flawed thinking of true in big idea 4 can become problematic. In OSEP's letter to state directors of special education in 2011, it was clearly stated that the use of RTI strategies cannot be used to delay or deny the provision of a full and individual evaluation of a student. So EC directors may consider setting some monitoring practices to ensure students are not lingering in intervention when there is evidence to suspect that a disability may exist. This again will require collaboration with general ed partners in order to make good decisions. Factors to consider when determining whether or not the child is suspected of a disability and should be referred to special education for an initial referral would be things such as the child has received high quality instruction, including differentiated core, and when appropriate, supplemental and/or intensive interventions that are appropriate for the child's age or state-approved grade level standards. Considering multiple sources of data that suggest whether or not the student is meeting grade level standards or is not progressing towards meeting standards. Or if they're progressing at a rate that is insufficient to reduce the risk of failure after an appropriate period of time. Other things to consider: the type, intensity, and duration of the instruction and intervention that is required to make sufficient progress. Is it actually exceeding what general education can sustain alone? Whether that student's performance is unique when compared to their peers, and this would include culturally and linguistically similar peers. And that whether or not their performance can be explained by other, more plausible factors other than a suspected disability, such as lack of appropriate instruction, poor attendance, weak intervention delivery. So these are some guiding questions to think through when we are considering whether or not we suspect a disability. When we look at a framework that we might establish for special ed decision making, might begin with the decisions points that are specific to the rule outs. So the prerequisite information that's brought forward, we would start there with information that's brought forward through a review that suggests that limited English proficiency is not a primary determinant factor. Maybe a factor, but not primary reason why the student is struggling. That the prerequisite information brought forward indicates that adequate instruction in reading has been established, and that appropriate instruction in math has also been established. If we move through those on the front end, it will lead us into, for LD specifically, another decision point that we would need to work through. That we would know from the prerequisite information brought forward that those primary factors such as sensory issues, and when I say sensory, vision, hearing, motor disabilities, an intellectual disability, emotional disability, any cultural factors, environmental or economic influences, and loss of instructional time have all been ruled out as primary factors for that student's struggles in the academic areas of concern. When we get through that information, through what's brought forward, It will guide us. Once these have been addressed, the focus may then narrow to the next decision point, which is whether the synthesis of all relevant data collected from multiple sources, and it starts with the review, including our progress monitoring data, to individual diagnostic, observational, interview, formal ratings. All of this information that's gathered within a full and individual evaluation suggests consistency in the story being told of this child. When we have synthesis of the data that reflects consistency across the data sources that we've documented, we can then feel confident that we are prepared to move on to special education eligibility, prong 1. It doesn't stop there, as Lynn referenced earlier. Not shown on this slide, but of course, when a child meets prong 1 as having a disability under IDEA, then we also have to establish that the disability has an adverse effect on the student's educational performance, whether it be functional or academic, and that they require something different than what they are able to receive and access through the general ed curriculum or specially designed instruction. As with other decisions, the decisions around adverse effect and need are based on all the available data that has been brought forward through the evaluation. Although this framework is clear, there are many variables that we know contribute to good decision making. Any missteps in the first 2 areas may weaken, and actually will weaken, our special education decision making. These steps build from one another, but we need for today's purposes, we won't be focusing too much on how we're going to go about dealing with the prerequisite information, but we will focus some more on the synthesis of all the relevant data and ensuring that it reflects consistency across the data sources. The relevant data that we will synthesize in establishing that those last 2 criterion, 3 and 4, would of course come through our documentation of the student's strengths, the areas that have been identified as suspected need, any parent information, observation data, diagnostic assessment data, and any other relevant data would be fed forward into our decision making. Additionally, we would be reviewing the data that's brought forward and collected regarding the student's performance in the targeted areas of concern in comparison to peers, which may include but is not limited to those data sources that you see listed there. Universal screening, benchmark assessment, progress monitoring data, any norm referenced assessment data if that applies, and any district or state assessment data if it's available. The other data that we would need to synthesize would be data reflecting the rate of growth in the target areas of concern in comparison to their peers. And that is within the context of progress monitoring, that the data is reflected graphically and rate of growth is calculated. These feed into our synthesis. And when we synthesize all of the relevant data and determine that consistency exists across data sources to tell us that inadequate achievement has been sufficiently established and insufficient rate of progress has also sufficiently been established. You can see the data sources that would feed into those 2 decisions, and it is not reflective of a single source of data. When we have all of these things reflecting consistency, we may then proceed to special education eligibility decision-making for students that we suspect have a learning disability. Taking these data sources into consideration, assess where you stand, where your school stands, where your district stands. The first 2 areas are already required of our policy. The first box indicating all of the information around strengths, suspected need, parent information, observation data, diagnostic, and any other relevant data is required. We also require for SLD these data sources to be considered to help to establish inadequate achievement, even within a discrepancy model. Are all these data being documented and synthesized prior to arriving at special ed eligibility decisions? With the exclusion of this last box down here, these are data sources that teams should be relying upon to establish their decisions around LD currently. And it kind of helps us to put things into perspective on where we are, assessing where we are, and where we need to go.
Thanks, Lynn. This is Lynn Loser again. If I had to choose one takeaway for you from my perspective as an educator and advocate for students with learning disabilities, it's this. Evaluation has two purposes: determination of eligibility and the identification of the specially designed instruction a student requires in order to accelerate progress beyond that which was realized during the provision of multi-tiered supports. This can be accomplished through the use of an instructional model of evaluation embedded within a multi-tiered system of support framework. So, not that we're counting, however, it is 3 years, 10 months, and 28 days, excluding the end date of July 1, 2020, or the full implementation date of July 1, 2020, or 1,428 days from today to July 1, 2020. So it's not intended to create anxiety for you, but it is intended to recognize that we did provide a 5-year timeline for the implementation of this policy to give LEAs plenty of time to prepare through the implementation of a multi-tiered system of support. So what can be done to begin preparing for full implementation? It all depends on where you, your school, your district is with these big ideas that Lynn and I have shared today. Regardless of where you are, you could start somewhere. In fact, get started and then get better. So what can you do to prepare? You can start by supporting implementation of a multi-tiered system of support in your LEA. As I said before, 97% of traditional LEAs are in an MTSS cohort. And we have many charter schools who are also participating in those cohorts. Know who is on your district or charter MTSS implementation team. Increase understanding of the work by watching the 21-minute video that's located on the Multi-Tiered System of Support wiki space. In fact, take some time to review all of the content on the wiki. Review the district or school MTSS plan and consider, what is my role? Implement instructional practices and the use of the district-wide problem-solving process with fidelity. Increase your understanding of available data sources, which should include academic, behavior, and social-emotional data. The professional development for the implementation of the SLD policy will occur primarily through the MTSS Professional Development Plan. Implementation of the policy requires implementation of a multi-tiered system of support.
Other things that I want to point out, specific to school psychologists, in supporting implementation of a multi-tiered system of support. If you are a school psychologist, advocate for school psychology to be represented on the district level MTSS implementation team. That actually is one of the suggested disciplines in the selection criteria for that has been put out by the MTSS delivery team. So advocate that school psychology is in fact represented there. And ensure that communication loops are established from the MTSS implementation team back to the entire school psychology department within your district, your school, your charter, whatever, wherever you are, wherever you work. Because, you know, and that would naturally flow if school psychology is represented on the implementation team, then that feedback loop would more easily be established back in. If you're in a department of more than one, it would easily flow back to your department through the point of contact that's installed in your implementation team. What else can you do to prepare for the transition is to understand and adhere to the existing policy requirements for evaluation and identification of students suspected of a disability, and more specifically of students suspected of a learning disability. As Lynn referenced, they are our most prevalent IDEA identified classification here in the state and nationally. At 37% of our kids with IEPs are identified as kids who have a learning disability. So when we have a better understanding and adherence to the existing policy, we would assure that we have adequate, that we are documenting and assuring adequate instruction in reading and math, and that we are ruling out that limited English proficiency is not a primary determinant factor in the child's academic struggles. The existing policy requirements for evaluation include the use of progress monitoring data that reflects the results of the targeted interventions that were delivered to the student. They're required as one of your data sources, and progress monitoring data is required as one of your data sources and has been, regardless of the type of model that you're utilizing to determine LD. Whether it's in a 15-point discrepancy, an alternative to discrepancy analysis, or within an instructional model or an RTI-based evaluation. I can't underscore enough how that will position you better when the transition into full implementation occurs on July 1, 2020. If you remember the slide I referenced, you can see what we should be doing and synthesizing currently, regardless of the model of identification we're using. Other types of things that you can do to prepare is utilize the resources that are available. Lynn has a listserv that is specific to education around specific learning disabilities. We have some links that we will provide, but the school psychology listserv will be more frequently used, and this is not just specific to the communication list that I have for lead school psychologists, but the entire field, the entire discipline. And I encourage you, if you're not a member of the listserv, to join. I will make sure that there is the information embedded in this slide before we send out the updated slides with any questions and answers on them. Take advantage of the professional development opportunities that will be in place over the course of the next few years. We're going to talk about a couple in just a minute. There are also SLD fact sheets that Lynn will be developing and putting out on a regular basis, and our SLD implementation guide that is nearing the stages of finalizing our draft form. We have just a few minutes, and just to kind of really look at quickly, for those of you that haven't seen the framework yet of the implementation guide that's being established, this slide lays out all of the different components that will be addressed and included and guided on within that guide.
So the implementation guide will begin with an introduction to SLD identification within a multi-tiered system of support. framework. And I also want to emphasize that this implementation guide can stand alone, but it will be part of the overall MTSS implementation guidance that's published also. We'll have some information in there about intent to implement and what will our transition period look like, or notification of transition to full implementation between now and July 1, 2020. We'll have a large section about what is a specific learning disability, what are the 8 areas of a specific learning disability. And then criterion 1, looking at adequate instruction, and criterion 2, looking at the exclusionary factors. Back up to that section on specific learning disabilities, we'll also have a section in there on dyslexia.
And then, moving through, as Lynn referenced, there will be, each of the 4 criterion will be laid out with some guidance, examples of how to implement, and of course resources will be linked in to help also determine unexpected underachievement and insufficient progress, to ensure that there is adequate information for all available to guide them through those 4 criterion. And then as you see down at the bottom, nearing the bottom, we have some work going on right now around establishing universal criteria for evaluation reports. And the documentation processes that exist are under revision currently around how we utilize our documentation systems to help guide us through in making good decisions, in this case around learning disabilities. And there will be some additional pieces that are attached to what we referenced as our big idea. One of our big ideas around the problem solving does not cease at the point of special education identification. We will be walking through guidance on the IEP development that is data-based, and progress monitoring of effectiveness of the specially designed instruction, as well as, of course, reevaluation will be addressed there, and there will be an FAQ section that's also embedded in. And that will be it is a live document that will be updated and enhanced over time as information becomes available to us. Is there another slide before this?
Skipped up. Yeah. So these are some sources of communication visibility where you can stay current with activities around multi-tiered system of support throughout our transition period. So we have a link there to the MTSS Wiki. If you're not familiar with that, that is chock full of very valuable information. The MTSS delivery team also has a Facebook page. You can see that they also have a Twitter account, as well as I have a Twitter account that you can follow. If you want to sign up for the SLD listserv, there's a link there for the SLD listserv. And then, of course, Lynn McCord has her school psychology listserv. So those are some important sources of information. If you sign up for my SLD listserv, that's one of the primary ways that I am getting those SLD fact sheets out to folks, as well as they're sent to all charter school directors and EC directors and traditional LEAs. So we did want to share with you some upcoming professional development opportunities. I'm excited to let you know that Dr. George Batch from the University of South Florida, that co-directs the Florida Multi-Tiered System of Support, will be conducting a pre-conference institute during the Exceptional Children Conference. This is designed for 3 to 5 member district level implementation teams composed of cross-departmental members, including the LEA Exceptional Children Director. We strongly encourage a school psychologist to be a member of this team. The Institute will focus on the district and school level structures and resources necessary to implement SLD eligibility within an MTSS model. Dr. Batch will also be providing a 2-part general session for administrators, as well as a 2-part general session titled SLD Eligibility Within an MTSS Model, What does it look like? And is it really about a search for effective instruction?
And then again, additionally, Lynn and I are not competing. I will be having, as I have, a school psychology institute that will be for school psychologists, a full-day session that is specific to the use of multiple sources of data to arrive at special ed decisions that are valid. This will cover all disability classification. Well, actually, it will cover our top 4 disability classifications that are relevant to school psychologists, which includes specific learning disability, other health impairment, intellectual disability, and autism spectrum disorder. As you heard, Lynn's pre-conference institute with Dr. Batch will be limited to a small number of teams, and there are, definitely, I think assessing where you are and what you need right now would be a good way to make a decision around which institute might serve a better purpose. But those 2 are being offered this November at the Exceptional Children's Conference. Again, ongoing, you'll see more of this going on as this year begins to ramp up. There will be EC Division sponsored state and regional meetings with, there will be areas where SLD specific focus will be plugged in to some of the regional meetings if we have directors on the webinar currently, and then of course at the leads meeting for school psychologists, as well as other opportunities that may come up throughout the course of this year and next year. Webinars will be something that we hope to continue delivering to provide updates where we need to get into a little more detail than just sending out newsletters and tweets. And also the hope is that we could make some of these things short, self-paced learning modules that can be built into the existing system at the Department of Public Instruction. So those will be things to look for as we move into the year 16, 17 and count down, to the July 1 effective date. As stated earlier in the webinar, for any specific questions that you may have, please post them in that question box that is on your dashboard, your webinar dashboard. There's a question box. Please enter in questions. We will answer those questions and add them to the slides for posting. Again, like I said, if there are a high level of questions that are sent in, a high number of questions, then we will create a companion document to go along with this webinar today. I will also let you know that 4 out of 5 of the webinars that I've been involved with this summer have been recorded. We are working on getting these webinars transcribed so that the entire audio version with the transcript may be offered out for consumption. This process, of course, will take a bit longer because we have to have transcription attached to it, and we expect that within, the next 2 weeks, all of these will be complete. When it is, all the webinar attendees will receive a communication that will direct them to where we will house the webinars. Those 4 out of the 5 will be housed with audio and the transcriptions, and you are welcome to and are encouraged to share that information with others when it is posted publicly. This concludes today's webinar. Both Lynn and I thank you for taking the time to listen in today. We hope that the information provided has been useful, and we wish you all a wonderful afternoon.